When a weary cop follows a lost dog through the dark streets, he never expects the journey to lead to a shocking discovery. A doll, a hidden past, and the unwavering loyalty of a stray dog uncover a truth that will change everything. What happens next will break his heart and heal it. The call came in just after dusk, the kind that didn't warrant sirens but still tugged at something in Officer Mark Delaney's chest. Loose dog, possible hit and run. It was the fourth one that week. Normally he wouldn't have responded. Animal control was supposed to handle these. But the dispatcher's voice was tight, like she'd already tried them, and they hadn't picked up. Mark was already driving the western edge of town anyway, where the pavement thinned into dirt and the streetlights gave up entirely. He'd grown used to the silence out here. Fields broken by barns that hadn't housed animals in decades, fences that leaned like old men in the wind. The town of Ridgeland was mostly quiet, and lately, a little too quiet. It wasn't crime that kept Mark awake at night anymore. It was what got ignored. When he turned down Miller's Bend, he saw the shape dart into the trees, small, limping, and fast despite the obvious injury. He slowed the cruiser, rolled the window down, and listened. Nothing but the sound of insects and the soft creak of trees swaying in the breeze. Then a bark. Not a warning, not aggressive, more like a plea. He pulled over, cut the engine, and grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the underbrush, reflecting off a pair of eyes. The dog didn't run. It stared. One paw was lifted slightly, trembling, as if it couldn't decide whether to flee or beg for help. "Hey, buddy," Mark said softly, crouching low. "You all right?" The dog took a cautious step back, then another, limping slightly, before turning and disappearing into the woods. But it didn't bolt. It moved slowly, like it wanted to be followed. Mark hesitated. He'd heard of animals doing strange things, leading people to children lost in the woods or dragging help back to a collapsed owner. But those were stories. This was just a stray, wasn't it? Still he followed. The ground was soft from last week's rains. His boots sank into the earth with every step. The flashlight flickered across twisted roots and old soda cans, the remnants of someone's long-forgotten party. And ahead, always just out of reach, was the dog. Not running, not hiding, leading. It took nearly 15 minutes before the woods gave way to a clearing Mark had never seen before. A crumbling foundation hinted at a structure that had once stood here, long since devoured by vines and time. And in the center of it all, the dog sat, waiting. Mark stepped into the clearing, breathing heavily, heart thudding not from the walk, but from the growing sense that he was not alone. And he wasn't. At first he thought it was a log. Then he saw the tiny hand, pale against the dirt. A child. Unmoving. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, rushing forward. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. Mud streaked his clothes, leaves clung to his hair. His breathing was shallow, but there. His lips were cracked, hands trembling with cold or fear or both. Mark stripped off his jacket and wrapped the child in it, pressing 2 fingers gently to the boy's neck. A pulse. Faint but steady. He reached for his radio. "This is Officer Delaney," he said, voice tight. "I need medical at my location. Child found unconscious in the clearing off Miller's Bend. Get here fast." He looked up. The dog was still sitting there, unmoving, watching. "Is he yours?" Mark asked, not expecting an answer. The dog only tilted his head, then walked slowly over and curled beside the boy, resting his head gently across the child's legs like a guardian refusing to stand down. That was the beginning. The boy, later identified as Adam, had been missing for nearly 3 days. His mother had reported it, but with no signs of abduction and a history of custody battles, the case had slipped into that frustrating gray area of law enforcement. Not enough evidence, not enough time, not enough people to care. Until now. Mark stayed with the child until paramedics arrived, holding his hand and murmuring the kind of reassurances he'd once sworn he'd never give unless he meant them. And as the sirens approached and red lights danced through the leaves, the dog stood, backed away, and vanished into the trees. The EMTs took over, and Adam was rushed to Ridgeland Regional. Mark gave his statement, made the calls, stood by as the child's mother arrived screaming his name. But in his heart, something had shifted. It wasn't just the boy. It was the dog. That night, long after the paperwork was filed and his shift should have ended, Mark drove back out to Miller's Bend. He parked in the same place, flashlight in hand, and stood in silence by the edge of the trees. "Where are you, buddy?" he whispered. "You saved that kid." The trees didn't answer, but somewhere deep in the forest, he thought he heard a bark, low, soft, like a thread being pulled across the dark. Over the next few days, the story spread. Stray dog leads cop to missing boy. The headlines didn't care about the doubts, the strangeness of it all. But Mark couldn't stop thinking. How had the dog known? Why hadn't he run? And more importantly, where had he gone? He started leaving food at the edge of the woods, a sandwich, some water, once an old blanket. Each morning the food would be gone, the blanket nudged into a makeshift bed. Paw prints marked the muddy edge of the clearing. Then, one night, as he sat in his cruiser with the window down, sipping cold coffee and listening to the breeze through the trees, the dog appeared again. No sound, no warning, just those amber eyes in the dark. And then, without a sound, he turned and walked. Mark stared. "Again?" he murmured. But he followed, because now he believed. The second trail the dog led him down was rougher than the first, narrower, tangled with brambles and half-forgotten deer paths that twisted like veins through the thick of the woods. Mark had no idea how far they'd gone. His phone had no signal, and the moon hung low behind drifting clouds, casting only the faintest silver on the forest floor. But the dog, who he had started calling Shadow in his head, never slowed, never hesitated. There was no sniffing or backtracking, just that same steady pace, ears pricked, tail stiff, as if he were on a mission only he could understand. Mark didn't ask questions this time. He knew, somehow, that whatever they were walking toward, it mattered. The air grew colder as they moved downhill, deeper into the part of the woods locals referred to as the Basin. No trails, no maps, just an expanse of forgotten land choked by overgrowth and whispered about only in cautionary tales. Mark had always dismissed those stories. Now he wasn't so sure. After nearly an hour, the trees began to thin. Shadow stopped at the edge of a clearing, his body suddenly tense, head low. Mark stepped beside him, shining his flashlight into the open space ahead, and froze. In the center of the clearing stood a structure. Not a building exactly, more like a cabin pieced together from wood too old and nails too rusted to be safe. The roof sagged, one window was boarded over, and what looked like a child's tricycle lay half buried in leaves just outside the crooked door. There were tire tracks, faint but visible, leading in and out. This place hadn't been abandoned, not completely. Mark's stomach twisted. He crouched low, motioning for Shadow to stay back. The dog obeyed, sinking into the brush like a ghost. Mark moved slowly, hand hovering near his holster. The silence here was suffocating. No crickets, no wind, just the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the high-pitched whine of anxiety screaming at the base of his skull. He reached the cabin door, paused, and knocked gently. Nothing. He knocked again. Harder this time. "Police," he called. "Is anyone inside?" Still silence. He tried the handle. Locked. He circled to the back. There, a smaller door hung slightly ajar, its hinges corroded but barely holding on. He drew his weapon, steadied his breath, and pushed the door open with the tip of his boot. The smell hit him first. Mildew, old food, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that turned his stomach before he could place it. Inside, it was dim, but not dark. A bare bulb hung from a wire strung across the ceiling, swaying slightly as if someone had been there moments before. The walls were covered in children's drawings, dozens of them, taped or pinned with thumbtacks, houses, trees, stick figures, some bright, full of sun, others less so. Mark stepped in, eyes scanning. There were sleeping bags on the floor, toys in a plastic bin, bottled water and canned goods stacked in one corner. This wasn't just a hiding spot. Someone had been living here, more than one person, and for a while. He moved toward a closed door at the far end. As he reached for it, he heard it, barely a sound, a shift of weight, maybe a breath. He froze, listening. "Hello?" he said, softer now. "I'm here to help. You don't have to be scared." Nothing. He opened the door. The room was small, barely wide enough for a mattress, and in the far corner, wrapped in a blanket and gripping a teddy bear so tightly it looked like it might burst, was a little girl. She blinked at him, wide-eyed, unmoving. Mark holstered his weapon and knelt. "Hey, sweetie, it's okay. I'm Officer Mark. You're safe now, all right?" She didn't speak, but her eyes flicked toward the door, then back to him. Cautious, hopeful. Mark held out a hand. "Can I take you home?" A pause. Then, slowly, she nodded. He carried her out gently, careful not to make any sudden moves. Outside, Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, ears perked. As soon as he saw the girl, he let out a low whine and trotted over, sniffing her hand, tail wagging softly. The girl's face changed. She smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it was there. Mark called it in. This time, he used a secure line. Quiet, calm, deliberate. Backup was on the way. A team would sweep the cabin, catalog everything. But Mark wasn't thinking about that right now. He was looking at the girl, at Shadow, at the way she leaned into the dog like she'd known him forever. "How did you find her?" one of the deputies asked when they arrived. Mark looked down at Shadow. "I didn't," he said. He did. The next day, the girl, her name was Mia, was reunited with her aunt, the only family she had left. She'd been missing for 2 weeks. No one had expected to find her alive. And yet, there she was, eating soup in a hospital bed, petting a stray dog like he was her lifelong protector. Mark stood outside the hospital room and watched for a long time. He didn't need to go in. He'd already said what needed to be said. But Shadow was different. When the nurse tried to keep him out, Mia cried. So the dog stayed, curled at the foot of her bed, head on his paws, amber eyes always half closed but always watching. Mark left the hospital with more questions than answers. He drove the back roads that night, winding through the dark with his window down, listening to the rustle of leaves and the murmur of the wind. He thought about how many others might be out there. Children hidden in places no one thought to search, waiting for someone to see what the world ignored. Waiting for a dog like Shadow. And for the first time in years, Mark Delaney felt something unfamiliar and fierce settle in his chest. Purpose. Not the kind he wore with a badge, but the kind that came when you realized the world wasn't broken. It was just full of people who'd forgotten how to see. And one dog who hadn't. Weeks passed since the rescue of Mia, But for Mark, the world still felt like it was slowly spinning off its axis. He didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way Shadow seemed to have some kind of radar for lost things. Or maybe it was the quiet bond the dog had with Mia, who had become more animated and alive with every day that passed. He couldn't get over how that bond had formed in the middle of nowhere, when all odds were stacked against them. Mark had been to the hollow places. He'd seen the shadows, smelled the mildew, and felt the deep, gnawing fear that lingered in the very soil. It wasn't just the evil that had rooted itself there, but the apathy, the kind of indifference that allowed someone to disappear without a trace. But what had shaken him the most was that Mia's rescue wasn't an isolated event. There were more stories, more faces, too many that never made it to the headlines. He kept thinking about the missing kids, the ones whose names were just whispers in an old report, the ones whose faces weren't plastered across news screens or flashing in a police database. Mia had been found, but who would find the others? That thought gnawed at him constantly. And then, one evening, the answer came. It was late when Mark received the call, one of those calls that didn't make sense at first. The dispatcher had spoken with an urgency Mark hadn't heard before. "Officer Delaney," she said, her voice tight. "We need you to come to Pine Hollow. It's the dog again. He's back. And this time there's something different." He didn't need to ask questions. He grabbed his jacket and left without hesitation. The drive to Pine Hollow felt faster than usual, the headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the road ahead. It was as if the world knew he had to be there, as if it was guiding him. When he arrived, he found Shadow waiting by the edge of the forest, the same spot where Mark had first encountered him weeks ago. The dog's eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and he stood perfectly still, not a single movement except the slight twitch of his ears. "Shadow," Mark whispered, calling softly to the dog. Shadow's tail flicked once, but otherwise he remained silent, staring into the darkened woods. Mark approached cautiously, following the dog's lead. They were back at the clearing, the one with the old cabin, the one that had revealed so much about the darkness festering in this town. But now, the air felt different. It was thick with anticipation, almost like the ground itself was holding its breath. Mark crouched beside Shadow, his heart racing. The silence stretched on longer than was comfortable. For a moment, he thought maybe Shadow had led him out here for nothing, that perhaps this was just another wild goose chase. Then he heard it, a faint whimper, followed by a low, desperate growl. Shadow's ears perked up, and he moved forward slowly, head low to the ground. Mark followed, heart pounding. The dog didn't hesitate. It was as if he knew exactly where to go, exactly what to find. The whimpers grew louder, now mixed with the sound of something scraping against wood. Mark's pulse quickened. This was it. Something was here. Someone was here. They reached the cabin, but the door was already open, hanging on its last hinge. Shadow entered without a sound, disappearing into the shadows of the structure. Mark followed, keeping his steps light, aware of the fragile nature of the situation. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of old, damp wood and the sharp tang of something metallic. Blood? No, it wasn't that strong, but it was there, like a ghost of something unspeakable. The room was dark, the only light coming from a crack in the walls where the moonlight filtered through. Mark's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and then he saw her. At the far corner of the room, curled in on herself, was a young girl, no older than 6 or 7. She looked up slowly, eyes wide with fear, her body trembling. Mark's heart nearly stopped in his chest. Hey, it's all right," he said softly, moving toward her. "I'm not here to hurt you." But she didn't respond. She just stared at him, her mouth trembling as she clutched a stuffed bear to her chest. Shadow padded over to her, sitting just out of reach, but close enough to offer comfort. The girl's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Mark. "Are you all right?" Mark asked again, kneeling just a few feet from her. She nodded, a small, barely perceptible movement. And then, just like that, the dam broke. The tears came, silent and steady, as she finally allowed herself to cry. Mark didn't move. He stayed there, kneeling on the cold floor, until the sobs slowed to hiccups and her breathing steadied. The dog never left her side. After a few moments, Mark stood up and pulled out his phone, dialing in a request for backup. The girl's rescuer wasn't him. He wasn't the one who had found her. Shadow had done that. And just like that, Mark realized something else. He wasn't just here to protect people from harm. He was here to listen, to the ones who had no voice, to the ones who had been lost. Shadow had led him here, but Mark knew the dog was guiding them both toward something greater. There were more to find. There were always more to find. And somewhere, in the forest's darkness, a child was waiting. The rescue of the girl marked a turning point. It wasn't just the discovery of another victim, though that, in itself, was enough to keep Mark awake at night. It was what the girl's arrival symbolized. It was a glimmer of hope in a world that had seemed dimmed by years of neglect, violence, and fear. Shadow had led him to her, but the question that weighed on Mark's mind was how many more shadows lingered out there, unseen, unheard. Mark could hardly believe the magnitude of what they had stumbled upon. Every time he thought he had grasped the depths of the horror lurking beneath Pine Hollow, the story would twist in on itself, revealing yet another layer of cruelty, another chapter of suffering. Yet, with each new discovery, Shadow seemed to grow more determined. It was as if the dog understood that the end of one chapter wasn't a conclusion. It was just the beginning of another search, another race against time. By the time the girl, whose name was Ellie, was safely handed off to the authorities, Mark found himself unable to leave the woods. It wasn't just his duty as an officer. There was something more personal at play now. Shadow was no longer just a stray dog who had stumbled into town. He had become Mark's silent companion, his guide, and the keeper of all those silent voices that needed to be heard. The following days were a blur of interviews, debriefings, and quiet nights where Mark found himself staring out into the forest, unable to shake the feeling that the work wasn't finished. Ellie had been found, but the path leading to her was still littered with empty spaces, spaces where other children might be hidden, abandoned in the shadows. The case had grown too large for just one man, even one as relentless as Mark. Federal agents had joined the investigation, bringing in resources and expertise that Mark could only dream of. It wasn't long before the quiet town of Pine Hollow became the focal point of a nationwide search for missing children. But Mark didn't care about the spotlight, the press conferences, or the headlines. None of that mattered. All that mattered was finding the others, finding the ones who had been left behind. And so the searches continued, with Shadow by his side every step of the way. The dog was relentless, scouring every inch of the forest, leading Mark deeper into the thickets and hollows where no one had dared to look before. Each time, they found something. A broken toy, an old photograph, a discarded article of clothing, but each clue only opened more questions, more dark corners to explore. And then, one evening, it happened again. Mark had been driving down a dirt road, his headlights cutting through the fog, when Shadow suddenly perked up in the passenger seat, his ears twitching. The dog had been eerily still for most of the drive, but now he was alert, his eyes focused ahead, as though he had spotted something in the distance. Mark slowed the car, glancing at Shadow. The dog's nose was pressed to the window, and there was an intensity in his gaze that Mark had come to recognize. It was the same look Shadow had worn when they first found Ellie. It was the look of determination, of knowing something that Mark could only guess at. "All right, boy," Mark said softly. "Let's see what you've got." He pulled off the road and followed the trail. Shadow led him down. They ended up at the edge of a dense patch of forest, the trees so thick that even the moonlight barely made it through. Shadow's steps were sure, his movements confident, as if he was following a path only he could see. Mark stayed close, knowing that the dog's instincts were sharper than his own. It wasn't long before they came across something. In a small clearing, partially obscured by underbrush, there was an abandoned shack. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the first shack they'd come across, but something about this one felt different. The air was heavier here, thick with the stench of rot and decay. Mark took a deep breath and stepped forward, his hand on his gun just in case. Shadow was already ahead, sniffing at the door, then backing up as if urging Mark to move in closer. Mark hesitated only for a moment before pushing open the door. Inside, it was dark, darker than Mark had expected. The ground was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. Mark could barely make out the shapes inside, but there was something there, something that had been left behind. As his eyes adjusted, he saw a faint glimmer of light coming from a small crack in the far corner. Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding. Shadow was at his side, still moving with that quiet determination. And then Mark saw it. A small handmade blanket lay crumpled in the corner of the shack. There was nothing else, just that one blanket, an abandoned relic of something lost. But as Mark reached for it, something caught his eye. Beneath the blanket was a small, battered doll. The eyes were scratched out, the face distorted, but the doll was unmistakable. A child's possession. The kind of thing that had once been held close, loved, and then discarded like so much refuse. Mark knelt down beside the doll, his hand trembling as he picked it up. His thoughts raced. Who had been here? Who had left this behind, and why? The answers eluded him, but there was no time to dwell on them now. "We're not done yet, are we, boy?" Mark whispered to Shadow, who stood silently at his side. "There's more. There's always more." Mark placed the doll back on the ground, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the darkness hadn't been defeated yet. But Shadow was still there, still leading him forward, and Mark knew that no matter how many times they were forced to confront the shadows, they would keep moving. Together. And in the silence of the forest, under the weight of what they had seen, Mark knew that there was still hope. As long as Shadow was by his side, they wouldn't stop. Not until every last shadow was chased away. Mark's mind was reeling. The discovery of the doll had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the doll itself. It was the reminder of how far the darkness spread. This was a fight that would never have a neat conclusion, no matter how many names were crossed off, no matter how many criminals were apprehended. Some things would always remain broken. As Mark and Shadow made their way back to the car, the dog's presence beside him was oddly comforting. The journey was far from over, and yet, for the first time in days, Mark felt a sense of clarity. There was something about the dog's unwavering loyalty, its silent determination, that brought a peace he hadn't known he needed. "You know, boy," Mark said, his voice softer than it had been in days, "I never thought I'd find someone like you. You've been the only one who hasn't given up." Shadow didn't respond, with words, of course, but Mark didn't need him to. He could sense the quiet understanding between them, the bond that had grown stronger with each passing day. Mark had thought he was the one leading, but Shadow had been guiding him all along. The car ride was filled with the sound of the engine and the occasional rustle from the dog beside him. The night was still young, but Mark's exhaustion was palpable. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going at this pace. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, and his mind had started to feel the effects of it. The weight of the case had settled into his bones. But as they neared home, something shifted. In the distance, Mark saw the faint outline of a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But as they drew closer, Mark could make out a small form, a child standing alone in the dark. Shadow's tail began to wag, his eyes locking onto the figure. Mark slowed the car, his pulse quickening. Was it another child? Another clue in the puzzle they had been desperately trying to solve? He parked the car and got out, keeping his eyes on the figure as he approached. The child didn't move, didn't seem to notice him coming. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he drew closer, his hand instinctively resting on the holster of his gun, though he knew he wouldn't need it. The child wasn't a threat. But there was something eerie about the stillness, the way the child stood motionless, as if waiting for something, or someone. When Mark was close enough, the child finally turned. And as their eyes met, Mark felt the world shift beneath him. The face was familiar, though it took him a moment to place it. It was Ellie, the girl they had rescued. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "Ellie, how did you get here?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she took a step toward him, her small hands reaching out as if searching for something. Mark's heart ached as he knelt down to her level. "Ellie, are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight. She finally spoke, her voice quiet and shaky. "I'm not scared anymore, officer," she said softly. "I know you're going to keep me safe." Tears welled up in Mark's eyes. This wasn't just the child he had rescued. This was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had endured to get to this moment. Behind him, Shadow stood silently, as if watching over them, always there, always ready to protect. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable. Mark reached out, pulling Ellie into his arms and holding her close. It was a brief embrace, but in that moment, he felt the weight of everything they had lost and everything they had gained. It wasn't just the end of a case, it was the beginning of something else, a new chapter in a long, difficult journey. As they stood there, in the quiet of the night, Mark realized that he had found what he had been searching for all along. It wasn't justice, it wasn't closure, it was peace, a peace that had been hard-earned, found through darkness, and forged in the loyalty of a dog who had never given up. They had done it together. And for the first time in a long while, Mark allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't as broken as it seemed.